I was saying before, the topic of the session is about greenhouse gas emission assessment for an urban mobility plan, taking Sousse in Tunisia as an example. So the idea is that you will understand the importance of quantifying greenhouse gas emissions in urban mobility and assess the climate mitigation potential of transport transformation in a city. Also identify the data that is needed to calculate these greenhouse gas emissions from urban mobility, and also build forward-looking scenarios. So not only to create inventory with the data that is available today, but also to project in the future what's going to be the pathway that these emissions are going to take based on certain actions and activities contained in an urban mobility plan. And the third one is to understand how to use the Mobilize Your City Emissions calculator, which is one of our flagship tools that help the cities to make these calculations of greenhouse gas emissions related to urban mobility. So as for the content, we'll have 5 sections. One is the welcome and housekeeping that I'm doing now. Then I will introduce briefly the Mobilize Your City Emissions calculator. And then for the rest, I will give the floor to our speakers today from the EuroMed Transport Support Project, because they're going to explain and introduce the project first, the urban mobility plan in Sousse in Tunisia, and then they will explain what they did in this technical assistance provided to the city to assess the impact of this mobility plan in Sousse in terms of greenhouse gases emissions. And the last part, we will have some time to questions and answers and feedback and the farewell. So the speakers I was mentioning before, sorry. We have Julien Allaire, Senior Urban Transport Non-Key Expert from the EuroMed Transport Support Project. Julien have many years of experience in the transport sector and urban mobility, and most importantly, as part of the Transitec team, he participated in the construction of the National Urban Mobility Policy in Tunisia, that he will also briefly introduce today. And then Emily Ball, who's a junior urban transport non-key expert of the EuroMed Transport Support Project, who was very engaged also in the development of this technical assistance and in the preparation of the calculations of greenhouse gases emissions related to the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan in Sousse. And then me, Nicolas Cruz, I'm Sustainable Mobility Expert at the Mobilize Your City Secretariat, helping with the preparation of the webinar and introducing now the Mobilize Your City emissions calculator. So Julien and Emily, welcome and thank you for being with us here today. So just to start, and as promised, I would briefly introduce the Mobilize Your City emissions calculator. So first of all, before going specifically to the tool, I would like to mention that greenhouse gas emissions accountability and calculation is part of the Mobilize Your City core indicators. So there is this publication that Mobilize Your City prepared a couple of years ago, in which we propose a monitoring framework and these core indicators to follow up on the implementation of a sustainable urban mobility plan and progress in general on urban mobility. And you can see that the first indicator is transport-related greenhouse gas emissions, because in general, our SUMPs and the SUMPs that are prepared under Mobilize Your City should have this climate perspective. So the SUMPs should aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But not only that, and also to improve access to public transport, reduce the traffic fatalities, so related to road safety, to improve air quality, considering that vehicles have a huge impact on local pollutants. And then also, of course, increase the modal share of non-motorized transport and public transport, and enhance the affordability of public transport. So just to mention that greenhouse gas emissions is only one of the indicators that we use to check the progress on urban mobility and sustainable urban mobility. And this is important, as I was mentioning before, because sustainable urban mobility plans and for us, for Mobilize Your City, are a tool to pursue these climate objectives that were set by many countries in the Paris Agreement framework. So Mobilize Your City would like to support this ambition through local action, specifically through the preparation of these urban mobility plans. And the indicator that we would like to calculate is this reduction of annual greenhouse gases emissions in terms of CO2 equivalent in a SUMP scenario compared to a business as usual scenario. And I will explain this further in the next slide. So there's two ways to report this, and it could be in a per capita base or in a net base. And this is important because in many contexts in our cities, for example, the population is expected to grow a lot still, so it's very difficult to demonstrate that we're doing something in urban mobility without considering, for example, per capita emissions, because at the end the net emissions are going to grow, but then we can see that by person the quantity can be less. So a bit more of our approach to greenhouse gas emissions modeling and methodology. So as I was saying before, when we prepare a SUMP, there are different phases. So for example, at the first phase, there is the diagnosis, and related to urban mobility, this means that we need to do a baseline for indicators. And for greenhouse gas emissions, it means that we need to gather data to create this inventory of greenhouse gas emissions related to urban transport. But this is just a photograph in time. This only tells us, and this year, for example, in the graph, it's the yellow circle. In 2015, we have this amount of emissions. And then in phase 2 and phase 3, what we're going to do is try to project these emissions on time based on different elements that we could include in this assessment. And based also in some assumptions. And we're going to create normally two scenarios, one business as usual, in which things continue to be handled in the same way. So it's the red line that you can see. And considering this scenario, we're going to reach certain quantity of emissions. And then we're going to compare this scenario based on a SUMP scenario. So when we implement the actions that we want to propose in this sustainable urban mobility plan, we want to consider how much the emissions decrease. And this needs to be done for a period of time, normally 10, 15, 20 years, for example, from 2020 to 2050. And then what's interesting is to see what's this reduction of emissions. And then for the phase 4, there's a need to do an ex post assessment, so to actually verify if the scenarios were accomplished or not, or to what extent. So this is the theory, and this is all framed in this avoid, shift, and improve approach, because at the end, what we want to promote in the action plans of the SUMPs are related to avoid more traffic or trips in general, shift towards more sustainable modes of transport, or improve the technologies or the management of the system to make it more efficient. And this is important because this is directly related to the data that we include in the inventory, but also in the scenarios that we create when we try to project the emissions in the business as usual scenario and in the SUMP scenario. So this is just a technicality, but I think it's important. And it's like when you're creating these calculations for a city, there is, let's say, a defined territory that but it's also it's related to other places around. So, for example, a city with their neighborhood cities or dormitory cities, we try to estimate the emissions only in the urban perimeter within that city, to try to avoid over calculations or like an overestimation of the emissions that we have in the city. So as you can see in the red box, we try to include in our calculations only the emissions that are happening in the city, and everything that goes beyond we shouldn't consider. This has technical challenges to consider, but then this is what we aim for, to be in line with international protocols to quantify emissions. So saying that, there is the theory. Now we pass to the emissions calculator for Mobilize Your City. And this is a tool that is intended to help local, regional, and national authorities in developing this greenhouse gas emissions calculation based on the theory that I just mentioned. So it's a ready-to-use tool that is Excel-based and that you can download on the website of Mobilize Your City. So the tool, as I was saying, it aims to help cities to calculate this road and rail transport greenhouse gas emissions at the city or the country level. So we can use it at both different levels. And with the tool, you can first create an inventory of the current situation. You can estimate the business as usual scenario. And thirdly, you can create also a climate scenario to compare. This is just some elements about technicalities and practicalities of how to use the tool. So for example, once the data is gathered, 2 or 3 work days are necessary to generate the models. Also, to use the use of a transport planning tool to deliver input data is recommended. So for example, to use it in the framework of developing a SUMP. And the tool is compatible with the IPCC inventory guidelines, so the one that the UN climate secretary uses to report on emissions. And then the tool is available in English, French, and Spanish. So I'm not going to go into the detail on this because then we're going to see the example of SUSE, but there is data requirements that the tool needs to be completed, especially socioeconomic factors, data about transport demand, fleet energy consumption, and existing emissions data from before. And what's important here is that the data collection is quite intensive and time consuming, and this is the most challenging part of completing the task, rather than just making the scenarios and the inventory, because the challenge here is to collect all the data needed to create the calculations of greenhouse gas emissions. So the content of the current emissions calculator, as I was saying before, is this inventory, which requires some inputs related to, for example, how many kilometers the cars are passing by in the city. And at the end, we gather transport performances, total mileage, modal splits of the city, and then of course, greenhouse gas emissions. And this is quite similar for all the scenarios compared to the inventory, just that for the scenarios, we need to consider some other assumptions of what's going to happen in the future, for example, related to growth rate of the population, or the change of fuels, or the transformation of the energetic metrics of the city and the country. And then the final output that we want to check is this emission savings from the business as usual scenario compared to the climate scenario. Oops. So just to finish, everything that I presented now, it's available on the website, on the Mobilize Your City website. And I take the opportunity to say that we have a new website, a revamped website that it's much easier to navigate for you to find the publications and the tools that we make available for our member cities and countries, and also our partners. And in this new website, you can access this site that is dedicated to the emissions calculator, that, as you can see, it's our flagship product with more than 6,000 downloads. And then there is also the user manual. There are tutorial videos, and also the methodological approach that I was presenting before. So I think that's all from my side. Now I give the floor to the colleagues from EuroMed Transport Support Project. And I thank you again for being with us today. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for this introduction and for this presentation of MobiliseYourCity calculator, as it was the tool we used for what we will present now. And we will show finally how much it was useful to calculate GHG emissions for the municipality of Sousse, or for Greater Sousse Agglomeration. Let me first start with the presentation of the project, EuroMed Transport Support Project. This is, in fact, a project that is due to Euro-Mediterranean Transport Cooperation, financed by European Union, and it has a specific topic on a specific focus on transport. The objectives are to increase safety, increase efficiency of transport, reduce environmental impact, and promote regional economic integration in Mediterranean region. So with the partner countries, you see the list on the screen. And we are here involved in the second component of this project, which focuses on urban transport. The objective of the technical assistance we are presenting here is in fact to make the link, to bridge the gap between the NDC, the National Determinate Contribution of Tunisia, and the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan that was validated by Greater Sousse Agglomeration. In fact, as any party of UNFCCC, Tunisia has to produce NDC. And this is really to answer to some climate commitments. And in the transport sector, Tunisia benefited from the support of MobiliseYourCity through the French Agency for Development, directly to the Ministry of Transport in order to elaborate a national urban mobility policy. And responding to the MobiliseYourCity program, this national policy aims to mitigate GHG emissions, as well as improve accessibility of the people in urban areas. And we have been involved as Transitec in this elaboration. And on the other side, we've been involved also in the SUMP elaboration of Greater Sousse. You have to know that there is no national framework for mobility planning in Tunisia yet, even if it is now in the NUMP, and the SUMP from Sousse was supported by the Swiss cooperation in order to promote integration of urban development and transport in the third agglomeration of Tunisia, which is about, you will see, 500,000 inhabitants. And the technical assistance we are presenting here was to bridge the gap between the local planning and the national policy, as well as the climate commitments. in fact, what we can see, and I guess you can feel the same in your own countries, is that you have the top-down approach with the climate commitments and the NDCs that sometimes define some activities to develop in order to mitigate GHG emission from transport sector, but it's not always aligned with the local planning for urban transport, and it is what we finally wanted to test with this technical assistance. It was really to see how much the local plans, the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, is aligned with the national commitments. Will it be enough, in fact, to answer to this commitment, or should we do more for mitigation? And also, the second challenge was, of course, to see how the Greater Sousse Agglomeration could benefit from climate finance, could benefit from international support to finance urban transport infrastructures. So we conducted this technical assistance at the end of 2022, and we did a final workshop to raise awareness about climate issues, because clearly we understood that the local stakeholders were not everybody was not aware about the challenges, and especially the challenges for Tunisia, as it is an hotspot in Mediterranean region in terms of climate change, to promote the link between the public policies at the local level and the national commitments, present the results of the calculation we made with the MobiliseYourCity tool, and identify the levy to reduce GHG emissions in urban mobility in Sousse, and so to create the debate with the stakeholders on those challenges. So you may know that we are now in a situation that the CO2 emission per capita worldwide is not growing that much at the moment, and the commitments for 2030, 2050 are much more, how to say, we have a clear constraint from the Paris Agreement. This constraint or this commitment from COP21 is to reach a scenario where the global warming will be not more than 2 degrees and as much as possible 1.5 degrees. And what we wanted to show here is that the NDCs, if you add all the NDCs from the different parties, you see that compared to the business as usual, in fact, it is of course better. So that's the orange here with unconditional NDC scenario. It means that the emerging countries are not benefiting from international support to implement their climate policy, and it is even better if there is this support from international partners. But you can see that there is a gap between the 2-degree scenario and the NDC scenario, the sum of all the NDC scenarios with this international support. And finally, this is a big challenge at the international level and at the national level to have better commitments from NDCs. So that has to be mentioned here, as we will now refer to the NDC. And you can see that for Tunisia, in fact, the business as usual is expecting to have in 2030 about 50 gigaton of CO2 emitted from Tunisia, and with unconditional efforts, it will be reduced by 17%, and with international support, it should be reduced by 37%. So the question is really how, at the local level, we could contribute to the climate effort, and how in urban mobility sector we could have an impact that is, to my mind, and knowing the NDC from Tunisia, maybe higher than what is already committed in the NDC. And the National Urban Mobility Policy that has been elaborated for Tunisia, based on the EASY concept framework, enabling, avoiding, shifting, and improving the urban mobility in Tunisian cities, is elaborated to give more responsibilities at the local level in order to implement, avoid, shift, improve solutions. And SUMPs has to be developed in following this NUMP in urban areas with more than 150,000 inhabitants. So let me just introduce briefly what is in this Greater Sousse SUMP, which is targeting 2030 to implement what we have called a metropolis of proximities. Clearly, it is linked to what is now well known as the 15-minute city, and we wanted to finally develop this 15-minute city at the metropolitan level, as there is no yet in Tunisia metropolitan entities. It was for us really important to mention that perimeter, that area, and to really promote this 15-minute city at this level, as the SUMP has been developed in an integrated program integrating urban development and transport with the support of the Swiss cooperation. So the population of Sousse is about 585,000 inhabitants, and it is the agglomeration where the population growth is the highest in the country. The challenges are clearly inefficient urban mobility system, poorly performing radial bus network, low frequency of services, and very limited possibility to have multimodal behaviors, and paratransit has been more and more important, as well as private cars since the 2000s. The objective was clearly to improve the quality of life of inhabitants, and also the tourist attractiveness of the city, as it is a real challenge for the economic prosperity of Greater Sousse. So you can see here the results of the household survey in terms of modal shares, and you can see that cars is about 24% of the trips, the daily trips, and the minibuses is about 11% when the public transport network is only 2%. And so this vision we have promoted through SUMP is clearly to develop a good public transport system implementing a BRT, so through an agile way in such a city, considering that the size is not to have, let's say, a full BRT with as much capacity as the one in some millionaire cities, but at least to have this BRT system to facilitate access to the city center, and in the different secondary hubs in the city to promote as much as possible walking and cycling. I will let now Emily present the GHG emissions assessment that we have conducted based on this vision of Sousse SUMP.
Thank you. So now we are moving to the practical or more technical part, and I'm going to start by introducing the methodology that we used. So you might be familiar with the as-if approach, which is a general framework that offers a methodology to assess greenhouse gases emission of transport activity. It can be for passenger transport, or it can be for freight transport as well. So as-if it stands for activity, structure, intensity, and fuel. So activity is basically the numbers of kilometers traveled per passenger or per freight. Then you have the structure. It's also an important parameter because it's important to know if you have mainly buses, you have mainly cars traveling in the perimeter, because they don't have the same energy consumption. So we come to the intensity. This parameter will depend on a large number of factors. The first one is the type of motorization. It can be also the age of the vehicles. It can be the load factor as well, the way people drive, if they have a sporty drive or not. And then you have the fuel, because some fuel have a higher carbon content. For example, electricity doesn't produce any greenhouse gases emission during operation, but you have to take into account that it might produce greenhouse gases emission during the production. You have diesel, you have gasoline that don't have the same carbon content, and that's why it's the fuel is associated to an emission factor that will translate the carbon content into a number that will have an impact on greenhouse gases emissions. So this approach, the as-if approach, will assess the emission produced during a trip. I insist on that because you will see that there are two ways of evaluating greenhouse gases emission. The first one is the tank-to-wheel approach. It's the approach that we have chosen to assess the greenhouse gases emission of Greater Sousse, because they will only assess the greenhouse gases emission produced during operation, during the trip. For me, it's interesting to use this approach because you will have, because when you talk about SUMP, you talk about how people move. So you are talking about the emission produced during a trip, but you have also the well-to-wheel approach that takes into account the emission produced during the fuel entire lifestyle. So you will not only have the emission produced during operation, but also to produce the fuel, etc. So we can move now to one of maybe the most important parameter of the calculation method, which is the number of kilometers. You have different ways to determine this parameter. The first one is the vehicle kilometer. If you have any chains, you can directly get this number, and those are numbers that can get through that you can get through with traffic models, that you can get with traffic counts, for example. You can also get through GPS data, through mileage readings, for example. But it's a data that isn't always available. But you can try to rebuild this data using another parameter, which is the fleet. Generally, it's data that is available at the city level or at your perimeter level, because you can get it through the vehicle census that will count the numbers of vehicles in circulation on the roads. And then you can either use average annual kilometers traveled, or you can use, if you have the data, the number of kilometers traveled per vehicles. These approaches, those two approaches, the 1 and 2, are compatible with the MobiliseYourCity calculation tools because they are related to vehicles. And you can directly enter the data in the MobiliseYourCity tool. And we will see afterwards how the MobiliseYourCity tool make the calculation. But you have to enter other parameters. But those are two inputs that are compatible today with the MobiliseYourCity calculation tool. There is another approach, which is the inhabitant approach, as we can say, which is, according to us, and that's why we also tried, as part of this technical assistance, to have a look at how people move, and have a look at the impact of how people move, because it's something that we are convinced about. We are convinced that these inhabitant trips are more easy to understand for politics, because when you try to implement SUMPs or you try to implement mobility policies, you look at how people move and not at how vehicle moves. So that's something that is easier to understand for people like establishing the policies. Inhabitant trips can be, you can determine this data through household surveys that can give you directly the number of trips made per person and per day, the number of kilometers traveled per trips, the model split as well. And so using a loading factor, you can convert this data into vehicle data and then use it directly in the MobiliseYourCity tool. I won't be too long here. We just wanted to show you that data is really important. To do the study, we had different studies at our disposal. Those were studies at different levels. We had a study, for example, at the national level, the one from the National Urban Mobility Plan. We had also studied at the governorate level. That is a perimeter a little larger than the one of Greater Sousse. And then we had two studies that were made at the Greater Sousse level, which are the household surveys, and that gave us some data on how people move. And last but not least, we also had some data at the level of Sousse municipality, which is one of the municipalities that are composing Greater Sousse area. We didn't take, I'm precising it now, we didn't take into account the impact of freight transport, but it's also an important component of greenhouse gases emission assessment. And we didn't take into account the tourist-related flows. As Julien mentioned it before, Greater Sousse area is very attractive in terms of tourism activity. So it's also generating a lot of greenhouse gases emissions that we didn't take into account because data is not always easy to get and always easy to evaluate because of the perimeter. So to give you a quick overview of the inputs we had to do the calculations. So we tried to see, do we have the data or not to use the vehicle kilometer approach. As you can see here, we didn't have directly this data for private car, two-wheelers, individual taxi, and minibus. But we had this data for bus, Cybertrans, so it was easy to directly enter this data in the Mobilize Your City tool. So when we didn't have the data, we tried to have a look at the fleet. Maybe the fleet could help us to rebuild the data and to convert it into vehicle kilometers. So we had some data on the fleet through the vehicle census that was made at the governorate level, but as it wasn't the same perimeter, we had to make assumption and to try to evaluate how many cars are indeed in our perimeter or not. So that's an important step, because otherwise you won't be able to make the assessment. It's a step that it might be long, that might be difficult, because you have to dig into all the studies and all the data that you have at your disposal. But once you have this data, it's easy to then try to play with the data, to try to enter it in the Mobilize Your City tool and see how it can evolve, how it can have an impact on greenhouse gases emissions. We didn't want to show you all the detail of the methodology for every mode, but we wanted to show you for an example. We pick up the example of the car. So how does the Mobilize Your City calculation tool function? Basically, you will enter the data that you have. For example, we had the fleet for the car. And we made an assumption and said, well, we can imagine that 80% of the vehicle fleet is at the Greater is within the Greater Sousse area. And then we had to enter the average annual distance traveled per vehicle. So we had different type of data. We also exchanged with local authorities to know if they had an average annual distance, if they know about it. And we concluded that on average, each vehicle traveled almost 20,000 kilometers per year, but only 50% of those kilometers traveled were made within the Greater Sousse area, because when you have the mileage reading of the vehicle, you have a number of kilometers, but it doesn't mean that all these kilometers were made within your perimeter. Some were made traveling to another city, some were made during holidays. So it was, if you take into account all the kilometers, you might overestimate the greenhouse gases emission. But on the other side, if you don't take in sufficiently high percentage, you might underestimate the greenhouse gases emissions. Emissions factors are already entered in the Mobilize Your City tool, so you don't have to enter it yourself. And then you have the energy consumption. Our fleet in Greater Sousse area was basically made of gasoline vehicles and diesel vehicles. We had really few vehicles, electric vehicles in our perimeter. So we had almost 50% of gasoline vehicle and 50% of diesel vehicles. So that's the methodology. So here are the data that you have to enter and try to determine before entering it in the Mobilize Your City tool. So here are the results, for example, of the current situation. So you can see that almost 200,000 tons of CO2 equivalent were produced in our 2020 situation. So when you look at the emission produced per person, per habitant, and per year, we are at around 300 kilograms of CO2 emissions. What is interesting to point out as well is that a private car contributes to almost 75% of greenhouse gases emissions, and is also the mode which generates the most important part of kilometers. Once we had this result, we tried to compare it to other data sources that we had, because to see if it was consistent, to see if it was coherent. Here you can see that as part of the study that was made at the national level, the greenhouse gases emissions were assessed for passenger and freight transport. That's why the number is a little higher. And it's the same for one of the study that we had at the level of Sousse municipality. But when you look at the result of Greater Sousse study and at the result of another study that was made at the Sousse municipality level in 2018, you can see that on average, we are in the same range of kilograms produced per year and per inhabitants. So we can conclude that our numbers are consistent, are coherent, and it's a step that is also important because you can see if your numbers, your result means something or not. So let's move now to the business as usual and SUMP scenarios. So we did exactly the same thing, but first we tried to identify what are the parameters that can have an impact on the projection for 2030. So first, the activity, how can it evolve due to economic growth, due to urban growth, especially urban sprawl, because if you have urban sprawl, people are going to live further and further from the city center and are going to travel larger distances. So they are going to generate more kilometers per year. You have also the demographic growth as well. If your population increase, you will have more kilometers as well that are going to be generated. The structure, how can it evolve? If you have a development of alternative modes of transport, for example, if the bus network become more performance, will become more attractive as well, you can imagine that you can have a model shift from car to bus, for example. But on the other side, if you have an increase of motorization rate, because as we can observe in recent years, and we are going to show you a graph afterwards, there is an increase in motorization rate in Tunisian cities. So those parameters are also having an impact on greenhouse gases emissions. And urban planning, of course, if you develop infrastructures for cycling or for pedestrian, you can imagine that the modal split of active modes can also increase. And in terms of intensity and fuel, if you have an evolution of the fleet, imagine that you have an electrification of the car fleet, you can imagine that the greenhouse gases emission will decrease. If you have better motorization, vehicles that are more that consume less fuel, you will have also an impact on greenhouse gases emissions. So once we had all those parameters, here is the illustration of the demographic growth in Greater Sousse. As you can see, it's expected to increase and reach almost 800,000 inhabitants by 2030, which is the year in which the SUMP is expected to be implemented. So on one side, we have a strong demographic growth, and on the other side, we have also growing motorization rate. Through vehicle census, we could produce this graph and see that the average increase of the fleet car was around 5% per year, which is important. We had also a comparable growth for motorized two-wheelers, and some rate for individual taxis and minibuses, the rates were a little lower at around 2%, but they are also increasing. So that those parameters have, of course, an impact on the greenhouse gases emission produced. So we are reaching almost 300,000 tons of CO2 equivalent produced per year. We have also an increase when we look at the greenhouse gases emission produced per person, an increase. The car contributes to almost 80% of the greenhouse gases emission, while it contributed to 75% in 2020. So here, those are two other graphs that can show you that we have an increase in the number of annual trips, which is normal because the population is increasing. And on the other hand, we have the comparison between 2020 and the business as usual scenario, and we see that we have an increase. So here we have an increase between 2020 and 2030, whereas the greenhouse emissions should be reduced, as Julien mentioned it before, by 17% by 2030 and normally reach the threshold of 260 kilograms of CO2 per inhabitant to meet the commitment. So we have to do something. Of course, we can't stay and follow the tendency of the business as usual scenario. So how can we do that? So here it's an illustration. You have the model split. Here you see that there is an increase in the modal split of car and a decrease of the modal split of walk. People who walk were using the walk for their trips in 2020, maybe shift to the car in 2030 because of the growing motorization rate. And we have also, it's interesting to point out that we have an increase also of the modal split of individual taxi, because individual taxi are becoming always more collectives, because if we don't have an evolution of the public transport infrastructure and the public transport services, necessarily people will have to move to another type of modes, and individual taxi is one of the alternatives. So now that we had a look at the business as usual scenario, it's interesting first to see that before looking at the action plan, the SUMP action plan of Greater Sousse, it's interesting to see what are the levers, simply what are the levers for greenhouse gases emissions reduction. So we managed to identify 5 main effects, as we can say, that can have an impact on greenhouse gases emissions. The first one is the substitution effect, simply by reducing the number of trips that are made per day. How can we do that? Maybe by using home office, when people do not go to work anymore, but work from home instead. Then we have the mode effect. If we observe a modal shift from a car to public transport or active modes, we can expect a reduction in greenhouse gases emissions. Then we have the distance effect. If we manage to implement the mobility vision of the Greater Sousse SUMP and the metropolis of proximity, we can expect a decrease in travel length, because we are going to have several polarities instead of one big polarity. The loading effect as well has an impact, because it's good to have public transport, it's good to have buses, but if those buses are empty, it won't reduce greenhouse gases emissions, on the contrary. So the loading factor is also really important. And last but not least, the energy performance effect. If you have a reduction in energy consumption of your vehicle fleet, you can have a decrease in greenhouse gases emissions. So once we analyzed all these, we managed to apply it to the action plan of Greater Sousse and to see the impact of the implementation of SUMP action plans. So here you see that you have a constant, a stable number of trips produced per year, which is normal because we considered that between business as usual scenario and a SUMP scenario, the number of trips made per person wouldn't evolve. On the contrary, as we said before, the substitution effect wasn't considered here for a Tunisian city because we considered that home office is not that part of the culture in Greater Sousse, and it's going to be hard to have an impact through the substitution effect. So that's why we considered a stable number of annual trips, but we see an evolution in the number of trips made by walk and by car. We have a decrease and an increase. And in terms of greenhouse gases emissions per inhabitants, we see that through the implementation of SUMP action plan, we can reach and get below the threshold of the NDC commitments, and to simply meet the NDC commitments. But it would mean a decrease of about 30% of greenhouse gases emissions within 10 years, now less than 10 years. And in the end, we put again the model split. You can see that we are coming back to a similar model split within between the 2020 situation and the SUMP situation. We have the same share of car, but we have an increase of the model split of buses. And also, we don't see anymore here the two-wheelers, because we considered that we could imagine that two-wheelers wouldn't be used anymore as part of the SUMP. And that people would move from two-wheelers to cycling. And so that's why we completely removed two-wheelers in the SUMP evaluation. So that's for the technical part, and I will leave the floor again to Julian.
Thank you. Just to conclude and to let you then react, of course. So you have seen that with the implementation of the SUMP, of course, to do this assessment of CO2 emissions from business as usual and SUMP scenarios, we made many assumptions, and it was really testing also the tool and the policy. That's why the workshop we did in Sousse was really helpful to discuss with the stakeholders how much they consider how our assumptions feasible or not. And this is a result of the discussion. So going less than the 17% of the NDC seems possible if the SUMP is implemented in Sousse, especially thanks to the new BRT system. And then we tested also a scenario with electrification of the fleet, of the car fleet, especially. And we see that there is, again, a possibility to reduce the GHG emissions of urban mobility in Sousse. What is really something that we want to bring here, it's the fact that we have used this the link between the modal share and the kilometer traveled. Considering that we are developing a 15-minute city, we need to consider that some trips could be a model shift from maybe a 10-kilometer trip by car to 500 meters by walking, and considering that that could be a big change this way, and each mode has a relevant distance trip, and that's what we have tried to consider in this assessment. So some key learnings, they are on the street for record, but to go quickly on this to let you then react. There is a big challenge in bridging the gap between the vision of climate specialists at the national level and the issues of urban mobility decision makers at the local level, and there is a need to bridge the gap between those two visions, and the monitoring system is required to do it. In fact, that is also the idea behind the MRV system, and that's really what we want to promote in Tunisia with this exercise and through the National Urban Mobility Policy and the SUMP. For cities like Sousse, it seems to us really important to consider all the opportunities to reduce GHG emissions, because it's part also, it's a way to support actions to improve accessibility also. There is some gaps for sure on the methodology we have used for Sousse, notably because we have no information about tourism related flows, or as Emily mentioned, we have a lack of data in terms of freight transport. But at least we have been able to bring information about daily mobility for people, and then there is, and I make the link with the next webinar that MobiliseYourCity will organize very soon. There is a need for mobility observatories. It means to collect as much as possible data related to urban mobility in order to make the assumptions we finally made here more realistic, and to confirm sometimes some assumptions we've done to be sure that our understanding of the situation is really what we have in databases. So this is what we were really happy to present to you. And Nicolas, I give you the floor for the rest of the session.
Thank you, Julien and Emily. I think it was very interesting, the work that you did in Sousse. Also considering all the different elements that were under the Mobilize Your City umbrella, the NUMP in Tunisia, the Mobilize Your City Emissions calculator. So thank you very much for all that work, and also for the interest in collaborating with Mobilize Your City to accomplish this task.
Indeed.
I don't see any questions on the chat, but I invite the participants to raise their hands. Okay, we have one question here. Please, Fatia, I see your hand is raised. I don't know if you want to give some words. Take the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, donc c'est Fatia Almej du ministère des Transports de la Tunisie. Merci Julien et Émilie pour cette présentation très claire et très exhaustive. Juste une remarque peut-être par rapport au scénario climat. rentable à 2030, mais on doit prendre en considération les difficultés qui sont là pour la mise en œuvre et l'implémentation des projets et des réformes. Donc, on devrait aller peut-être au-delà de 2030, 2035, où on va vraiment avoir les résultats et les fruits de travail en back-office qu'on est en train de mener actuellement. Donc, s'il y a lieu de mettre un paramètre de probabilité de réalisation des actions dans le scénario climat pour voir à partir de quelle date on pourra avoir ces résultats de réduction des gaz à effet de serre. Et merci.
Nicolas, do you want me to translate? Fatia Neji, thank you very much for your question. Fatia is in charge of a national urban mobility policy implementation at the Ministry of Transport in Tunisia, and she mentioned the fact that the scenarios we presented are with an horizon of 2030, but in fact, the situation currently in Tunisia makes it difficult to keep this target, and so that probably some projects and measures won't be implemented before 2030, but maybe we should change the horizon to prefer 2035. She asked for a possibility to consider the probability of implementation. So thank you again for this question. It's really difficult to envisage the future for sure. And what was important in the work we've done here, it was clearly that we used the same horizon for NDC and for SUMP. So it makes it really easier in that case. And as the question we ask is really how the SUMP could contribute to NDC commitments. Clearly, why we have taken this challenge this way, it's also because at the moment the SUMP of Sousse has no legal basis, but the NDC is clearly a national commitment on the international scene, and so that was finally a contribution from Sousse to this international commitment that we were exploring through this assessment.
Thank you, Julian, for your answer and for the translation. Sorry, that was microphone was off when Fatia ended, but indeed, I think related to what you were saying, this exercise is very interesting because I think it's at least at Mobilize Your City is the first time that we're trying to analyze what's the link between these policies at the local level in relation with these national commitments, national/international commitments of a country. So indeed, it's like important to know how much we're contributing to these national efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then I know it depends on the context because sometimes there is this calculation by sector at the national level. Sometimes there is not, so it's more difficult to know if a sustainable urban mobility plan is indeed in line with what the NDC is proposing. So thanks again for that exercise that you accomplished. We have another question on the chat from Ferdinand Marterer. And I'm going to read it now. Has Transitec developed tools to estimate greenhouse gas emissions reductions, something that could be plugged in the transport model used to estimate the VKT following the different SUMP scenarios and therefore quantifying the reductions of each scenario? If yes, are such tools accessible?
Good question, because it's really the heart of the work we've done. In fact, as Emily mentioned, there is those two approaches or three approaches. The one to estimate GHG emissions, the one with the VKT or with the fleet using some average kilometers per vehicle, or through inhabitants trips. And as we had in Sousse a household survey and some data on fleet, we building the assessment of business as usual scenario and the GHG emission assessment of the SUMP scenario, we tried to make the link between those two approaches. And it's clearly not easy. And now we just want to confirm some assumptions we made for Sousse. And that's why the Mobility Observatory would be very helpful for that. And then we have developed internally a tool to do that and to play with figures, if I may say, in order to check the feasibility of the scenarios. That's not an accessible tool for the moment. We need on our side to use it a little bit more to make it stronger, frankly speaking, and then let's see if we can open it. For sure, it would be very interesting, I think, also for cities where you have clearly a lack of data. That's what we faced in Sousse, and to facilitate this exercise for technicians or decision makers to assess GHG emissions, even if you don't have all the data from VKT or all the data from household surveys.
Thank you, Julien. And indeed, I think this is a big question for many Mobilize Your City cities. This how to deal with this lack of data and how to use other tools that could help us use the available data and transform it into a format that is compatible with the emissions calculator methodology. There is another question on the chat. For your SUMP scenarios, you need to compute a modal shift among the population. How to do that? Did you only use the household surveys to compute this shift?
Maybe I can answer to these questions. As Julien mentioned before, we tried to develop internally a calculation tool to be able to play with the data, the inputs on passenger trips. And so we had indeed to compute a modal shift among the population. We did it through assumptions. We did it also through experience, through feedbacks we had from other studies we made, and we tried to make an assumption on the impact that the different actions of the action plan of the SUMP could have an impact on modal shift. But those were only assumptions that we made it based on the modal split we had from the household surveys and from assumption on how much impact will have the different actions of the SUMP action plans.
And maybe to add to this, one of the difficulties we have in that case, in the household survey, we usually focus on the modal split. But in fact, the length of the trips per mod is really a critical data, and sometimes it's really difficult to have clear data about it. And second, the number of trips per day per person. And this, of course, if the household survey say that you have 2 trips per day per person or 4 trips per day per person, you change totally the situation in terms of mobility, of course, but in terms of GHG emissions when you do the assumptions. And it is really important to consider the modal split, number of trips per person, and the length of trips per mod to really approach the results. And sometimes we had to test some hypotheses again in order to find results that seems to us relevant.
Thank you, Émilie and Julien. I think the challenge to know this modal shift is quite important and big, and it's usually something we don't ask because it's not included in this household service, and also because it's very difficult to ask people how they're going to change their behavior based on such a big project as SUMP. This is like really difficult to quantify, to know, and people might not give like the right answer. So I think these assumptions you were talking about are, for now, the only way to make these calculations. But of course, it needs to be secured and discussed with local authorities that know the context. I have a question before I go to the next question that there is on the chat related to these assumptions, because I was saying before, the challenge for many Mobilize Your City members is like to try to find the data. And this exercise you made in Sousse, you did it without considering data collection. So this was a fully exercise considering data that was already available from before. And because there was no data collection foreseen, you had to complement this existing data with some assumptions. But then in some cases, some consultants are very unsure and hesitant of providing these assumptions because it's very difficult to support them sometimes. So I just wanted to ask you, what's your vision about this trade-off between as consultants proposing the assumptions to complement the exercise and to have like a value and a total estimation, and on the other side dealing with the uncertainty that these assumptions are not sure that are going to happen in the future?
What I can say is that of course, in fact, first of all, it is really important to have a community of experts like we have today connected online to also get information about what is the situation in another city, how many trips per day per person. That we have worked in several SUMPs in Africa and in Europe, and the number of trips per inhabitant, it's always a challenge. And sometimes we are not really comfortable with this specific figure, and it depends a lot on the way the household survey is conducted. So I think we need to have some information from other cities to be sure that we said, for example, Emily said, in Tunisia, we expect that a car do 20,000 kilometers a year, which is quite a lot, in fact. But that's the only way we have found to match the car fleet size and the number of kilometers traveled we had as an information. And so then that would be helpful to have just more information about it to confirm this assumption. And I guess there is a big challenge in making the link with some agencies that are in charge of following car fleet, controlling the security, etc. Just to have some data that could be collected on a small size of vehicles, typically, just to confirm the assumption and to go further. So it seems to me that what we need is probably not to conduct a new household survey every year, because it's really expensive and it won't be helpful, in fact. It's much more to have some specific studies that could inform us on some, let's say, some I wanted to say black hole, but it's not really black hole. It's much more some aspect that we don't have enough yet enlightened the situation. So that's really what I would recommend, to have some different studies on different specific issues that could facilitate the work.
So I understand that the recommendation then is like to dare to make these assumptions, and then over time we will have this complement with further studies that might inform the previous exercises that might exist from before. And I think that's a really good approach, like to start thinking about this lack of data and then to start thinking how we fill the gap to start having this data at some point in time in the future. So related to, sorry, go.
And the idea of the observatory is really to develop some processes to make data coming on regular basis to a team which can follow the different indicators and have a comprehensive view on the situation. And sometimes there is some existing data that are not accessible, and sometimes there is some that we have to collect.
Yes, perfect. And just to mention for all the participants that are interested, that we're planning a series of 2 webinars about mobility observatories based on another project in Asia in which Julian was also involved. So today, most probably, we will be sending the invitations for a couple of webinars. And then if you're subscribed to the newsletter, you will get the invitations on your email. I'm going to ask this question that is related to the assumptions. If you could explain a little bit more if the annual millage of private cars is directly taken into account for the greenhouse gas emissions accounting, or a percentage of that mileage is automatically discounted due to the mileage traveled outside of the city or region that is being analyzed.
So you can't do it directly in the Mobilize Your City tool. It's an assumption that you have to do before. So if we take again the example of Greater Sousse, we had an amount of 20,000 kilometers traveled per year, but we considered that only 50% of these average kilometers traveled were made within the area of Greater Sousse. So we took into account in the end 10,000 kilometers, and those are the kilometers that you are going to enter afterwards in the Mobilize Your City tool. The Mobilize Your City tool doesn't make the conversion and the calculation between the discount of the total mileage and the kilometers actually traveled within the area.
Thank you, Emilie. And I think, I don't know if you know of any methods to cover this data gap, because I think pretty much it's going to be always an assumption unless we have super detailed data on all the trips that a car makes within and out the city. So yeah, I think this is also important not to overestimate or underestimate the greenhouse gas emissions in the city, but it's something that it's really, really hard to calculate based on real data and information. I only see one question left related to the availability online of all the tools that Transitech used to make this exercise, and if it's possible to make them available on the Mobilize Your City platform. So before I give you the floor, I can say Mobilize Your City Emissions Calculator is available on the Mobilize Your City website. And I was saying before, in the new version of the website, there is a dedicated page for the emissions calculator where you can find the tool, the Excel-based tool, and then the methodologies that are related to this, the manual, the approach to calculate greenhouse gas emissions, and some trainings that will be available in the future in that page, and also some case studies of cities that use the tool to calculate their urban transport related emissions. I know, Julian and Emily, you talked about some other internal tools that you used outside of the tool, but then I let you answer if that can be available online or not yet.
Not yet. I'm sorry for that, because really we developed this tool internally, but we, as I mentioned, we want to make it stronger with the other case studies. Let's say the challenge, in fact, is I think the most important is the method more than the tool itself. If we put the tool online, I'm not sure that it will be helpful. And that's what we want to develop more and more, this method to assess the simply with this context of lack of data in some cities, and then to start suggesting some data collection processes to facilitate the better scenarios and better assumptions. That's really what we would expect to do in the coming month, based on this work we presented today.
Thank you, Julien. And indeed, I think this is something that is also very context sensitive as we organize the information that needs to be included in the tool, because it comes in different shapes, formats, units. So there is like this process of organizing the information that might vary according to the city and the country. So that's why also for Mobilize Your City, we don't have like a template of this is what you need to do to gather all the inputs just before putting it in the tool. Thank you very much again. Juliana, I don't know if you have something else to add.
Yes, just one thing, sorry. Just to say that the municipality of Sousse is sorry to have not been able to join the conversation today, but they will be part of the discussion for the Francophone webinar we will have very soon. And you could also ask them in that case directly some questions about this work.
Thank you, Julien. And that's a perfect link to end the session, because the last thing that I was going to say was to mention that we're having the French version of this same webinar in a couple of weeks in June. So if you're interested in joining that session in which the municipality of Sousse will participate also, please send us an email, and then we will automatically include you in the link for the people that might join that webinar, just in case you're interested in the French version, because it will be exactly the same information that we just presented, with the difference that we will have the opportunity to have also the municipality of Sousse in the webinar. It's time to finish the webinar. But again, Emily and Julien, thank you very much for all the work and for the presentation today. And for the rest, keep tuned for the invitation to the webinars of the mobility observatories. And please subscribe to our newsletter and visit our new website that we just sent on the chat. I wish you a nice rest of the day and see you soon.